everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Daddy Chats, I believe this is now. How quickly time flies. I am here with the amazingly intelligent Home of History. Would you like to introduce yourself?
You flatter me too much. Thank you. Yeah, hi guys. I'm Home of History, and I make TikToks to try and encourage more young people to get into the subject of history.
Yeah, I mean, you're. I think I first discovered your TikToks purely on. I think it was an Alexander thing because, obviously, understandably, my timeline is mostly Alexander the Great. And it was one of your Alexander videos that brought in. I like your style because, obviously, on History Talk you have to be so quick, and you manage to eloquently explain things in like most of your videos are less than a minute. So obviously as well. And I think it's hard, especially on TikTok, to explain things in a way that TikTok allows for one thing, as well as in the time constraint. Have you ever found like issues with that?
Oh, certainly. It's something that I've experienced really my whole educational life. A lot of my teachers or lecturers will always just say to me, "Listen, you're getting far too much into the nitty-gritty detail here. You need to headlines. What are the headlines? Important things." And so it's something I've had to work on a lot, like my whole life, in work as well as online and everything. But yeah, it's actually so enjoyable because you really get to sit down and think, right, what are the important parts here that I really want people to know? What's the fun stuff? What's the interesting stuff? I want to put that forward. So totally, no, I definitely have experienced that on more than one occasion.
I mean, for me, I studied film at university, and for me, whenever I talk about my films or my stories, I spend like an hour doing it. And they literally had to sit me down and teach me, like, you have to explain the story you want to tell in 20 words. And that's helped me a lot. Obviously, with TikTok, I tend to do sketches, whereas on YouTube, I tend to just go on for hours. That's why I literally have a video on the Easter Truce, which is one of the least documented things about World War One. Right, I could barely I found like one newspaper article on it, and then a load of articles stemming from that one newspaper, and then one documentary where they interviewed a guy. And then I sped that into a nearly half-hour-long video because I just was talking about each individual thing. So it is, I think when your brain is wired like that, where you're like, everything is important, finding the narrowed down important bits is hard. And speaking of narrowed down important bits, we'll move on to our first topic of the day, which we definitely didn't just discuss before we started recording. I believe Carton de Wiart, the famous World War One soldier.
Oh yes, so that's been a recent discovery of mine. I happened across a volume of his book. It's called Happy Odyssey. And I saw it had a foreword by Churchill, so clearly this guy was important, but I'd never heard of him.
Wow.
And I opened up this book, and there was just the most bonkers story you have ever heard in your life that spans from his birth, perhaps being the illegitimate son of the King of Belgium, to being to being Churchill's personal representative to Chiang Kai-shek. He was captured during World War II. Yeah, he was captured during World War II and imprisoned by the Italians. Escaped once, then got caught again. He was a Victoria Cross winner. I mean, he was a Victoria Cross winner. There's a very famous portrait of him, actually, with his eye patch and his one arm, and he was just utterly fearless. And when he was asked after both conflicts how his experience of the war was, he said, "Well, I think I rather enjoyed it, actually." So. He's a complete eccentric, and I absolutely love eccentric people because I think that's what can really attract a lot of people who may not necessarily have been interested in history into the subject, and to sort of be like a gateway to them, if you will.
With characters like that, it is almost like you've taken them out of a novel, like a James Bond spy novel in a way. I mean, my introduction to him. Apologies, I'm coming off of the end of a cold.
That's right.
That's why I sound a bit bunged up. My introduction to him, as I said to you before we started recording, was through Sabaton, because they did a song about him. And the fact that he got injured so many times, and it was like, no, I want to go back. I mean, at one point, isn't he? He's missing an eye and in a hand at one point, isn't he? Towards the end, he's got a bit of lung missing as well.
Oh yeah, no, he was wounded quite a few times in World War One. He actually lost his eye in the campaign in Somaliland against the Mad Mullah, and
Right.
or the man known as the Mad Mullah, and he was injured even before that. On his first expedition, he actually went to fight in, I believe it was the Second Boer War, and he was shot on his first expedition out, and he convalesced and recovered, and then decided actually, I quite enjoy this, and so he went back and wanted to fight more. And no, yeah, during World War II, he was pretty much shot in every place one could possibly imagine, including, I think it was at the Somme. He was shot through the head and survived.
I didn't know he was like shot through the head. Like that's the fact that he still wanted to go and fight after all that took place. Now, he still had I don't know if it was really a compunction to serve for king and country as many felt, I suppose. I think it was more he was one of that rare breed of people who was almost addicted to warfare in a way.
Oh, I would definitely agree. I think it was entirely personally motivated. He wasn't a British citizen when he joined the British Army. He was a Belgian citizen, and he had to be naturalised as a British citizen after serving for an initial, I think maybe 5 years. I could be wrong on that, but he had to be naturalised as a British citizen. He was born to a Belgian Irish family, and so he didn't have British citizenship. So I think it was definitely a personal motivation. There's this quote somewhere, I think, in his book. I haven't finished reading it yet. Where he says that people talk about, the pen is mightier than the sword, but I definitely know which one I'd rather pick. And I think that kind of speaks to his character.
Yeah.
That he thinks that military might is the way that the decisions of the day will always be made.
Oh yeah, I think that speaks. I mean, that shows a great deal of wisdom, because if you look at human history, it is a lot of people say that victors write the history, when that's not always true. A lot of the times, there's many cases of Roman emperors where we see them have like records from in their life praising them. Like one of my favourite ones to always bring up is I will always defend Commodus. Yes, he was a bad emperor, right? But Commodus did nothing that a load of other emperors before him hadn't already tried and tested, and that he repeated a lot of the same mistakes in a way. And I think he was just trying to find his, because he was not ready to rule. His dad, it was what? Yeah, Marcus Aurelius was his dad, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. His dad completely failed to prepare him for leadership. And so he was just desperately trying to find his way. So I think he probably had a level of corruption, but again, he wasn't any worse than other Roman emperors. I could be wrong, because I'm not in-depth historian, but that's. And I told you at the start I'd go off on a tangent as soon as I got the chance.
No, go for it.
But the thing is, when you look at sources that I've been able to take a look at, I don't read as much as I should. I'm reading more practical stuff now, but I mostly read fiction. But a lot of the shows I've seen and documentaries I've watched, the Commodus is sort of, he's all right at the time. And then the second he's gone, everyone's like, it's the worst thing ever, boo. And then it's very clear, and this repeats a lot, and it happens to make the other emperors look good. And so it speaks to what I'm butchering his name every time I say it. I do apologise to any Belgians listening. But with Wiart, what he's saying there fits so well, because yes, you can own the world at one point, but the second you're gone, whoever else is strongest then has the ability to write about you, because they're in control with military might. There's no very few. The only nation I would say has had any ability to control itself without severe military might would be Venice. But then again, Venice just financed other people to fight their wars, and had many, towards the end, to the height of their power, had a strong military anyways. Sorry, I did go on a proper tangent then.
No. It's an interesting tangent. I think when people ask the question, what's mightier, the pen or the sword, it kind of discounts the idea that they might actually exist in a coexistence, if you will. Like, you can't really have one without the other, and that actually they feed into each other, kind of how you described it. It's interesting always to hear people debate these things, specifically with people like Commodus. There's often made this argument in a similar case that actually Gaius or Caligula wasn't actually as insane as one might think he was, and the efforts that he made early in his career to try and to re-centralize power towards the position of the princeps, away from the Senate, might have had a bad reaction from the senatorial class who were writing the histories, and therefore made him out to be insane. I'm sure that he probably had an aspect of being more violent than other emperors, which is still saying something. But was he completely as insane as they say he was? Well, maybe not. Maybe he was tyrannical in their eyes because he was trying to withdraw their ancient sort of well-established power that surrounded the senatorial class, and they didn't like that, and they tried to sort of almost damnatio memoriae him. I think that happens to a lot of rulers throughout history.
I mean, it happened to Julius Caesar when you think about it, because the main gripe the Senate really had towards the end was the fact that I believe he wanted to make a load of people in the north of Italy citizens of Rome, didn't he? And he wanted to extend the citizenship, which obviously upset a load of the senators, because it meant that they would have to deal with new representatives, and they would obviously weakening their power, which was a clever move. I don't think he did it out of the generosity of his own heart. It was a political move to weaken the Senate in a way and have these new people come in who would be thankful to him. So it was clever, and it's the to feed into what you were saying about them, the pen and the sword merging as one. You just have to look at Carthage, because yes, we know nothing about Carthage other than it was salted, and that was written by the Romans. But the only reason that they had that ability to write about Carthage in that way is because they beat Carthage militarily, ironically, with designs they stole from Carthaginian ships. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I heard it. Yeah, but it's
how in there's almost like that meme where people used to have "live, laugh, love" written on their wall. I honestly think that Cato had "ipse cogito sum Carthago delenda merce" written on his wall, something like that.
What does that mean, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So, disclaimer: my Latin isn't perfect. I did do it at school, but that is, as far as I'm aware, the translation of what Cato used to say at the end of every one of his political speeches. He said, no matter what the subject was, and therefore I think that Carthage should be destroyed. And that's the Latin, as far as I'm aware, the Latin translation of that.
That's that. Someone definitely had a grudge there.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
While we're talking about Rome, that does actually move on to the topic we have next, which is the Marcus Aurelius hot take that you've alluded to. What is your hot take?
Okay. So I perfectly respect Marcus Aurelius as an emperor, and I've made a video about this. But if one was to take a tier list of emperors, I think that Marcus Aurelius, for me, sits on the admittedly high end of the B tier, and it feeds into what we were talking about a little bit earlier on.
That is controversial.
So I definitely respect the military challenges that he came across and the way that he dealt with them, and circumstances surrounding the Antonine Plague, and culturally he was clearly very influential because he wrote the Meditations. However, as a ruler, I genuinely believe one of and probably arguably the most important role that you have is ensuring a smooth succession. And not only does that mean actually indicating who's going to come after you, but training up. And the reason that I think that Marcus Aurelius in particular is quite guilty of ignoring this responsibility is because he himself went through such a long and extensive period of training and being introduced to the nature of power and the nature of rule, and clearly himself was so thoughtful about it. I mean, you see it in the Meditations. I don't understand how you could say he is one of the greatest emperors ever if he did not successfully train up his son to become emperor after him.
Yeah, no, that's fair play. That's fair play. I was getting ready to debate you on that, and then I was like, actually, no, that makes a lot of sense. It does. I think. I mean, see, here's my hot take on Marcus Aurelius. I said this like kind of to Alcibiades' histories. I don't think he wanted to be emperor. I don't think he really liked the role. If you read his, like, because I've got a copy of Meditations, of course I do, I'm a Roman fanboy. Like, as I've started reading that, it's really clear, like, he enjoyed philosophy. I think, and his philosophical works are only just, in the modern day, I believe, really getting the majesty they deserve. Obviously, they already had it in philosophical circles, but to a more broader audience, maybe that's due to YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that. But like he, as a philosopher, his works were much more influential than some of, and this is going to be very controversial, some of the other ancient philosophers of the time. Like a lot, and it was clear to me, at least, that was where his passion and joy was. I could be completely wrong. Obviously, I've never met the man, but for the interpretation I get, like for someone who's meant to be training up an heir, obviously successfully doing everything else, but surely the training up the heir would be your priority, not writing some of the most influential philosophical works in Western history, if not in the history of the world. So yeah, my hot take would be, I think he wanted to be more of a philosopher than he did a king. I would say emperor, but king sounds more poetic.
See, that is interesting. Ironically enough, though, I reckon Plato and Aristotle would have been, not Plato, Plato and Socrates, sorry, would have been rather happy about that, because of course they thought philosophers should be kings. But but it's interesting you say that, though, because I genuinely, I'm of the belief that he never intended for the Meditations to be read. Those come across to me as if we're taking a historiographic approach to this, let's analyze the type of source we've got in front of us. That comes across to me as a very personal piece of writing. It's almost like the letters between Cicero and Atticus, his friend. That doesn't appear to me to be something that he wanted published. And I don't know if he wanted to be a philosopher more than he would have wanted to be a ruler. I don't know. I mean, the attraction of being a Roman emperor is unbelievable to resist. Yeah. He certainly didn't want to publish those works. I don't think those appear far too personal and introspective. It's not like Julius Caesar, where he wrote a personal account of the De Bellum Gallicae and then just published it and sent it out like a leaflet. It's so funny. If you read it, he switches in and out of first and third person so much. So sometimes he's saying, I did this, and then Julius Caesar did that, or as you say, Julius Caesar did this. Yeah. But no, I don't think he would. If he was going to be a philosopher, I don't think he would have wanted to stand on a soapbox and preach.
That's true. I mean, to be fair, you have a lot of everyone's favourite philosopher, Diogenes, I suppose, didn't like he was more of a he was very eccentric, and he's one of my favourite historical figures. To ironically quote Alexander, if Alexander wasn't my favourite, it would be Diogenes. I've always liked twisting that quote, because everyone's like, I see what you did there, and I'm like, yeah, no, it gives boost my ego a little bit. But Diogenes,
you're so tolerant of someone who's disrespected Alexander. But to be fair, who wouldn't be tolerant of Diogenes? He was the complete weirdo, but he lovable weirdo.
The brilliant thing about, like, because everyone brings this up, is like, whenever another content creator disses Alexander, I'm always in the comments like, sorry, what did you say? Like, as a little joke, because obviously I am the biggest Alexander fanboy. And everyone always goes, how is, like, the person you obsess over the second most, Diogenes, when he famously disliked Alexander to his face? Like, he mugged him off. He's probably the only person in history, like, because obviously it was Cletus the Black, I believe, wasn't it? Like, he disrespected Alexander to his face, and Alexander killed him. And Diogenes does it, and Alexander's like, oh, this is hilarious, I like this guy. Like,
and Parmenion as well. I mean, Parmenion, this great teacher figure that he had in his life, and it's just, sorry, buddy, you'll get a bit too powerful there for my liking.
You're getting a bit so. You start, Alexander is one of the things I will have to accept of Alexander, is he really did not like people either bringing up his dad. He clearly clearly, like, him and his dad, like, Alexander was definitely a mummy's boy. Like, when when his mum got exiled, obviously, Alexander was like, oh, I'm leaving court as well. Yeah, I think the main reason he didn't, that he got, I mean, obviously he was, according to the sources, then he spent a couple of days and nights, like, mourning what he had done to Cletus. But he didn't like people overshadowing him or bringing up his dad, because I think deep down he felt a sort of inferiority complex about his dad, because Alexander was a great general, but he got that from his dad. And the debate does rage on, is if Philip had lived long enough, would he have been able to conquer more than Alexander? And if that debate rages now, imagine what it was like back then to certain generals.
Okay, interesting though. Okay, can I interrogate that a little bit?
Go on.
As far as I understand, right, the initial justification for the invasions of Persia was as some sort of retaliatory mission for their invasions of Greece.
Yes.
Right? Now, one could make the case that the further conquests of Persia, out towards India to try and find Okeanos, were related more to a personal mission of Alexander. So, are you of the opinion that Philip would have even wanted to go further than Alexander? Would he have wanted to do more than liberate the Ionian Greek city?
Okay, so my personal view of how, if Philip had lived long enough to complete his Persian conquests, Philip would have just as easily done it as Alexander. Everyone, like Philip and Alexander are at the minimum neck and neck, and you can argue till the cows come home about which one was the better commander. I know obviously Philip has some very hardcore fans out there. My personal belief is the way it would have gone is Philip would have probably hit the same point, and Alexander would have wanted to push on, because Alexander was the main fuel of Alexander's ambition. To me personally, does stem from overachieving from his father, and then other, like, as Napoleon and looked up to people like Augustus and Julius Caesar, and Augustus and Julius Caesar looked up to Alexander. Alexander looked up to conquerors like Cyrus the Great and stuff like that. So the rule in history with conquerors is there's always a bigger fish. There's always someone else you can beat. And I think towards the end, Alexander was just trying to beat himself, because he probably saw himself as the king of the world at that point. I mean, we know he did. He referred to himself as such. And so I think Alexander would have formed his own, like, he would have waited for Philip to die, and then he would have pushed. He definitely would have conquered India. Because if he didn't have to start at Persia,
Ooh.
No, you don't think he would have? I think he would have. It would have taken him a while because of the different terrain. Actually, no.
Now, I'm a little biased here because I'm Indian myself, so I've got to support the homies, But I don't know. India is an incredibly. It's one of. Okay, so you know how people say there's the Persian Empire, right?
Yeah.
And well, okay, sure, right. What we've actually got is we've got a lot of different economies and cultures and civilizations and religions operating within a larger sphere. Well, it's almost subcontinental. It's like India, and it's not necessarily sure, he beat Porus, but it's not necessarily a case of just defeating. There's one institution that we can target, and everything will fall apart like that.
That's
You've got
true.
A lot of the broader cultures and things like that, and so that's much more of a political game as it is a military. So this is playing one off of the other. This is making alliances with such and such a person until it's so convenient for you to turn them on. And I think taking on India would have been as much of a challenge as taking on the Indian subcontinent, as we would understand it, as taking on the entire of the Achaemenid Empire. Would it have been possible? Certainly, I think it would have been possible. Would it have been easy or necessarily likely? I don't know. I haven't thought about it too much, but it's something that I would question.
It is, yeah, because I remember speaking to someone, and they said if Alexander had had a chance, do you think he would have kept pushing? And I remember originally saying, and I do take back this answer, that he would have tried to keep pushing until he got to the other side of China. I don't think when he hit China, he would have, like, some of the I don't know much about Chinese history, I will admit, but some of the commanders in Chinese history are insane in the strategies they employed. Like the little tidbits I know, especially the Three Kingdoms period. So I agree with you. I think he probably would have been able to pull off India, but it would have taken him a long time. Like you say, it's more of a political game. It's less, unless he could do what Kaiser did in Gaul, where he could force everyone into an alliance, and then he was able to take out the Gauls in one go because they was in one alliance. But would he have been able to go kingdom to kingdom, taking these smaller armies? Well, the first issue is it's completely different terrain. Obviously, he's going to be used to fighting more over flat plains and stuff, and the different environments of India are going to pose tremendous changes. Obviously, monsoon season, a lot of the soldiers he would have under his command. So if we're going off of the idea that Philip has conquered Persia and Alexander's like, I'm going to push into India, he's got, I mean, maybe some of the Persian soldiers would be more like capable of that, but to a lot of the Greek people he's pulled up from Athens and Sparta and the rest of the Peloponnese, they're going to be like, I ain't built for this, I want to go home. So...
Well, that was why the mutiny at Opus happened, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Yeah, and then he sulked and he marched them all through the desert. I mean, he did the quickest route. Yeah. I love that historians have, like, originally it
quickest route.
Yeah, it was the quickest route that actually lasted longer than the route that he could have taken. You know, he did. Yeah, I will admit, Alexander was 100%.
He really was like Achilles, wasn't he?
Yeah. To be fair, if we're looking at that easy, because Alexander probably would have read. It depends on how much his own ego got in the way. Because if it was going to be that difficult, would you believe he would have maybe moved west? Maybe have formed a sort of Roman Empire.
So this is the interesting part, because I think a lot of people, when we talk about Alexander the Great, they seem to forget there was an entire Balkan campaign right before he invaded Persia.
Yes, and I don't know much about it, I will admit.
No, neither do I. My knowledge is not too in-depth about that. But I think at least what we can say that demonstrates is that there is an awareness that there is an opportunity for conquest. And clearly, I don't know, I think you could make the argument the reason he fought there was for security, to sort of cover his back while he went after the main goal. Maybe that's one way to look at it. But I think it at least demonstrates that he was aware of there being opportunity, and for that, it was at least somewhat worthwhile for him. You know, he has got to commit years of his life, resources, thousands of men, time to a conquest. It's got to be worth it for it. But I think that the fact that he started there clearly demonstrates that he wouldn't have just dismissed it. He wouldn't have just gone, no, Persia's richer, I'm gonna go over there instead. He definitely, I think, had an idea of, this would be something that would elevate my status. This would be beneficial to my kingdom. You know? Yeah,
I mean, that's there was multiple writers in Rome who were like obsessed with fighting Alexander, and obviously, I believe you had the like minor Roman Republic at that time, so they wouldn't have been much for Alexander if he had cut. It would have been an interesting fight, but wouldn't have been as interesting as it possibly could be, because even by the time of Pyrrhus, Rome was a much more mighty foe. So it would be interesting if he moved west. Would he, like you say, there is the strong argument that he was just securing his flank so he could go off and conquer Persia. I think that he would have been obsessed, because Alexander was nothing if not curious. Like, he became obsessed with Persian custom. One of the reasons a lot of people so I think he would be less interested in looking at the West and the other more the cultures that he was accustomed to and similar to, and he would be looking at more like curious, because it's a weird thing. He conquered it almost because he loved it in a way. If you look at it, like he really, and one of the
love-hate relationship.
Yeah. Like one of the big criticisms his commanders and his companions had for Alexander was he really did integrate Persian culture into his court. And he, I can't remember who said it. There was at least one person who said it, that Alexander is more Persian than he is Macedonian at one point. It might have been Cletus, actually. I'm not sure. I can't remember. When I can remember the quote. I can't remember who said it. But to me, I think the attraction of the East would pull Alexander in. There's no way he would get near China. I think he would I think what would happen realistically is he would conquer the Indian subcontinent, and then he would probably stop there. But there's a whole other range of different rulers and military commanders he would come up against, and that brings whole new challenges, different tactics. So it's one of those what ifs I don't think we'll ever fully get an answer for.
I think he definitely had enough experience to have given it a go. One thing that actually surprised me when I was at university and I started studying the Achaemenids is, at least in the modern media, we get this idea that the Middle East part, that what we would now call Iran, is just like, we have this idea that it's just a desert. It's actually not that much of it is actually a desert. It's a lot of it's mountains and forests and grass plains, and so, and obviously he went off into Central Asia. And so if we're talking about, okay, what's his experience for applying certain tactics to certain geographies, he definitely would have had experience. But like we've said, and I totally agree, the Indian subcontinent is a totally different kettle of fish. You've got everything from the Rajasthan desert, you've got the fertile lands of the Punjab, you've got the Himalayan mountains and the Hindu Kush you've got to get through as well, the jungles further south, the floodplains out further east. It's a variety, and obviously different geographies inspire different cultures. And it's like coming back again to what we agreed on earlier. It's a much more of a political game. I think that he would have given it a really good go, and that if he was genuinely, and I believe he was genuinely interested in ruling these people and not just conquering them, because of how much he integrated himself into Persian culture.
Yeah.
I think he was smart enough to realize that I've conquered Persia, but if we want Macedon to conquer India, this is going to be a multi-generational effort.
Yes.
And he thought, right, okay, we've got to have, not just myself as with a prince. We've got to have capable generals that are getting trained up, local troops, establishing local resource lines and supply lines. He would have realized that this is going to be a multi-generational effort. And that would have been hard to get over, I think, with his ego, because I don't think you could say that Alexander didn't have an ego.
Yes.
But if he was smart like I believe he was, if he was smart like I believe he was, he would have, if he wanted to do that and he wanted to rule and not just conquer, he would have realized it would have been a multi-generational effort.
Agree. I think the biggest drawback would be his ego, because, I mean, the guy didn't, to our knowledge, again, it's similar to Marcus Aurelius, he didn't lay out succession correctly, which is why we had the Wars of the Diadochi, which, as many people on many of my Alexander videos have pointed out, that he did plunge a good portion of the ancient world into another 100 or so years of warfare. Because he didn't plan out succession correctly. So if we're looking at what we have from our timeline, would he reshape and replan and perhaps be more focused on succession than conquering? Because like you say, it would be, there's no way he could probably, he could take the Indian subcontinent in one generation, but he would lose it immediately after his passing. There's no way someone else, because the second there's a new person in, everyone's immediately right, okay, we're back. Right, let's go. We're kicking the Greeks out.
I think you probably agree with me on this. No one anticipated his passing. Nobody anticipated that. It was definitely a surprise. Whatever it was, whether it was alcohol poisoning or a parasite or just an unknown disease, I don't think anybody expected it, and nobody expected once he got ill to be that quick.
Yeah.
So. Oh God, this sounds like I'm kind of backtracking what I said about Marcus Aurelius, but to be fair, he was around for a lot longer in terms of just his age.
Yeah.
He probably hadn't gotten to that point, even for someone living in the ancient world who was thinking about a succession plan. He might have thought about it, the beginnings of it, but I think he would have probably been more around the age of 40, 45 before he started seriously thinking, right, I've got to put plans in place to
So,
stop
so
establishing success.
do you believe in the do you believe in the story that his last words were to the strongest? It's a story that his last words were. I think it was Hephaestion who leans in, and he goes to the strongest.
Okay. From my own personal interpretation of Alexander's character, could that have been something he said? Yeah, probably, because the guy, was one for a bit of drama. The historian in me says no, because I think that is a really good fit for like a tragic ending to an epic narrative. And it's the kind of thing that someone like, for example, Livy is. Take Livy, for example, right? We've got Livy making up speeches that people like Hannibal gave before he crossed the Alps. Now, did Livy have any clue what Hannibal said to his troops before he crossed the Alps? No. Does it make for a more interesting historical narrative? Absolutely. So more people are going to read through his stuff. I think that is a very fun way of ending off the story, or an epic story about an incredible individual. And I don't think you could point to any of the sources really and say, yeah, no, that's definitely his last words, or he definitely said that. So the historian in me says no, but I think it would have been something he could have done. Personally thinking, yeah, he could have said that because that fits his personality. Do I actually think he did it? No.
Fair. That's fair. I see. I've got a bit of. I have no evidence for this conspiracy theory, right? Which leads in.
Okay,
which
let's hear it.
I
love
leads into this.
Yes.
Right. So we know Cassander did unalive Alexander IV. To the best of our knowledge, as far as I know, it is pretty concrete that he did he poisoned or took out in some way Alexander IV. I can't remember if he took out Rosanna or not. Roxana, sorry. Right. So my conspiracy theory is, if Cassander took the throne of Macedon, is there a possibility that he may have poisoned Alexander? So if you have to go with the alcohol poisoning route with this, but obviously if you could, there are several poisons that would be untraceable. By the time it looked like he had died of alcohol poisoning, the poison would have kicked in. So is it possible Cassander maybe dug his fingers in a bit earlier?
Right, I see what you mean. The idea, there is massive precedent throughout the whole of history of certain sub-commanders and bureaucrats or lords or what have you offing the king or the duke or whatever in such a fashion. So the possibility is not ludicrous. I would just hesitate to move towards that without at least some kind of primary source evidence, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that Alexander was assassinated is definitely, I think, it shouldn't be something that anybody should immediately dismiss, because in terms of what ends up happening to very powerful leaders, that does demonstrably happen throughout history. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe someone will discover a new tablet or a new inscription that might be evaluated to be valuable evidence. We don't know.
Yeah.
But it's something that could have happened. It definitely would have added a bit more spice to the narrative. The wars of the. It's like the Wars of the Diadochi are kind of like a proto version of the Wars of the Roses, almost. I don't know if you could really make a huge connection to it, but it definitely has that drama to it.
I'd say the Wars of the Diadochi are a lot bigger than the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of that would be like if the Wars of the Roses then encompassed. Actually, you know what a bad comparison would be? The 30 Years' War would actually be a very good comparison for the Wars of the Diadochi. Because I love those, because it's meant to be Protestants versus Catholics, but it's not. It's how can we limit the power of the Habsburgs? When you're that's basically the 30 Years' War. I completely agree with it. Like I said, it's a conspiracy theory. I have, to my knowledge, there's zero evidence backing it. But it's my first and foremost trade is a storyteller. So I think that comes more from my channeling my inner Herodotus and going, this would be a nice little story and spin.
History fundamentally, I believe, comes from the art of storytelling. And there's this wonderful description that I think it's Stephen Fry actually gives of how
Love Stephen Fry.
Oral storytellers develop. Yeah, he's amazing. He's the British institution.
Yes.
Him and David Attenborough. He talks about how myth and subsequently history comes from people coming together over communal spaces like fire pits where people are cooking and listening to these stories either being sung or told. And I think it's kind of clear from what people like Herodotus and Thucydides did, is they were just taking another step along that line. And so we shouldn't dismiss the storytelling aspect of history, otherwise you and I would be out of a job, because it's rather important to what we're doing here. We're trying to tell a story to people and get people interested in it. But I think the difference is that, you know, maybe back then they're creating these myths and legends, and I certainly can say so for myself, and I could probably say so for you. We're encouraging others also to, rather than listen to a myth or story, just hear what we've got to say, and then I don't know, maybe go and pick up a book if you're interested in it, or go and watch another podcast or an audiobook or anything you can. You know, certain things are accessible to certain people, but I always try and encourage people to, if they find something interesting in what I've said, to go ahead and take another step and read into it themselves, because I think it can only benefit you.
Oh yeah, no, on all of my YouTube videos, I have all of my sources listed. I have them all. So I have is it sources first? I think it's the sources first, and then I have the attributions of all like the images I use. But I list, and I like, it's there not just to say this is where I learned. It's more so people can then go, okay, what bits has he omitted to streamline his video? In my case, I omit very little because I'm obsessed with putting absolutely everything in. But to further what you said, like storytelling, like I got a comment the other day was like, the way you tell stories makes them more interesting. I was like, that's what I'm aiming for, because at the end, what a historian's job is, a historian. I always say a historian's job is to like then take the information, and then it's content creators like us who come in. I mean, because I believe you've actually got a degree in known history, aren't you? So you are technically a historian.
I have a degree a bachelor's degree in ancient history. Yes.
Yeah. So you're like one step off me from like. So you guys come in and you're like, okay, right, here's the information. Now we take the information, then like I'm the little rung beneath, and I'm like, I can tell stories. And then like that's the role I sort of see myself in the historical like pecking order. But
I think you don't give yourself enough credit. I think that fundamentally what's important to being a historian is learning the skills of historiography.
Yes.
Things like source evaluation and recognizing that, right, okay, so if we've got this 2 stone tablets that are telling us the story about, for example, I don't know, the first settlement of, right, and this is saying this happened on this date. So we've got like the Res Gestae, for example. This happened on this date, and then this stone tablet is an inscription about something else. You know, we've got the pure facts, so like, you know, they correlate to each other, and we've got this happened on this date. Historians then have to sort of pull out of that interpretations of the evidence, and it's very important that people remember that famous historians from all around the world, like Hugh Bowden, Alison Weir, Dan Jones, they're all great people, but sometimes we have, you know, just remember that what they're saying is their interpretation of the evidence, and you know that's the important thing. And by presenting the sources yourself, what you've done there is you've pretty much categorically said that this is what I looked at. This is the story that I pulled out of it. If you have a different opinion to me, go for it. But you know, this is where I've got the information from. So don't discredit yourself. You don't necessarily need the degree that says I'm a historian to be able to demonstrate those skills.
I like that. That's a very good point of view to have. I think a lot of people, I think that's what makes history scary to a lot of people, is the idea that you need to, you know, that whenever you mention history, you get this image of an old guy sitting in a library surrounded by dust and cobwebs and ancient artifacts, and like I think you need more of the horrible histories thing. Like, I think it's a good thing that our generation has horrible histories come to mind, or even, for lack of, he's not exactly the best archaeologist, but Indiana Jones. I know a lot of people don't like the sort of glamorization of history, but that's the only way you can really, like, if if I was to sit there and do a video on the Vikings, be like, and the Vikings were evil, and but then I go, and then the Vikings came in and they pillaged and they set up this kingdom, and then there was this king and he had a war and they had heroes and villains. Then people are like, it gets from my perspective, it's hard finding that balance of good storytelling and fact, because with fact will inevitably knock out storytelling, and storytelling will inevitably knock out fact, and that balance, very just quickly, I recently did a video on Queen Ranavalona, the first of Madagascar.
Of Madagascar.
Which is very hard to because obviously she's known as the Diocletian of Madagascar and all that. She's got loads of names because obviously persecution of Christians and stuff. So reading up on that, you very quickly notice some of the sources are like spicing things up, and so it's you can see where the newspapers of the day especially were sort of like were radicalizing and glamorizing the story to create more of a spin of like, look what she's doing toward the Christians, when in reality, yes, she did some awful things, but the actual facts tame it back a bit, and you get to see more of her motives. So when you need to take the story side of it to make it interesting, people want to watch. But you also have to make sure the facts are there, because when you get into nitty gritty, a lot of what Ranavalona did was to stop her country being colonized, which she did perfectly. She succeeded at that. She then did also take out a big chunk of her own population quite aggressively.
Right.
So it's
okay.
Yeah, it's hard. It's not only that. I realise I've gone completely on another tangent again, where it's balancing. It's balancing. It's what I always say to people: is history is there's very few cases in history where people are good for the sake of being good or evil for the sake of being evil. There is a lot.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No. I agree with you. I think what we've basically happened upon is this revelation that I hope everyone comes across. Whoever's remotely interested in history, is that yes, there are those of us who have bachelor's degrees. There are those of us who've got master's degrees and PhDs, and those are very good at representing certain skills. But I don't want anybody to be discouraged from thinking they can't be their own historian because they don't have the degree. I would encourage everybody to go, look something up and maybe read a book or read an article on Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has its value. I will stand by that. Watch a YouTube video, listen to an audiobook.
The Wikipedia one's a spicy take.
Do anything.
The Wikipedia one's a spicy. I've heard more people saying it.
Okay, well, we'll get back to this.
Yeah, we'll get back to it. Yeah.
We'll get back to this, but I just think that what the important thing is with history, like, A, you enjoy it. That's the most important part. Yes. You enjoy it. B, you find it interesting, and then when you want to get to the nitty gritty, we get to see, which is, what questions are you asking when you're reading this? Now, some people will focus more on, well, was what this person was doing right? That's one question you can ask. One question you can ask is what this individual has recorded necessarily true? Are they trying to direct the narrative away from certain events and towards others? Are they making things up? Are they trying to be theatrical? Are they just really boring? All these things are important. And I think that if you go home one evening and you sit down and you open it up, and it could be literally the primary source, Livy's History of Rome, or it could be a book written by a famous modern historian about a certain period, and you sit down and you read it and you enjoy it and you start asking yourself questions about it, then you are your own historian in my book.
I think, I think that's a view that's been open. I mean, now, like I say, we're having a mixture of, so you have like my group, which are just the history buffs who like history. We learn from you guys, and then we go, okay, right, here's the story we're going to tell. But we've also got people like you, Historical Han, Stakui, I know, has got degrees in history. There's a couple others. When you go to list people, your name immediately goes.
Yes.
But we have so many people who are coming in who have these degrees now, who are opening it to a field. I mean, TikTok isn't the best forum. I do prefer YouTube, is why I'm always saying to people, like, on YouTube, Bite-Sized Ancient History is another one. Just popped into my head. But all these people, like everyone who has degrees, telling it in a story way, it does cut out the middleman in a way. But it also, it's like you said, it allows people to become their own historian. We just need to get over the bit where everyone's like, "Oh, I saw this 30-second video on TikTok. Okay, everything about this is correct," and then they stop. That's we don't want that to happen.
That's what we don't want.
Yeah.
No, we don't want that. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, there's always this. It's a very tricky subject. Talking about qualification and such and such a person does not have a degree in history. Such and such person has bachelor's, master's, PhD. It's a tricky one to navigate. They obviously have their own merits, but I think that it would be doing a disservice to the study and to the hobby of history even to say that no, you can't be a historian because you haven't done 3 years at uni. Yeah, those people are historians as well. You should be able to sit there comfortably in your own skin and think, I have an opinion of this that I've thought through, and that's the most important part to me.
Yeah.
I know we were going to talk about the Wikipedia thing. I wanted to just be clear on that because I realised that that might incite a bit of a disagreement in the comments. Now,
yeah.
I think it's useful, like with a lot of things. Okay, because this comes down to the skills of being a historian. You can't just look at one source and think that that's it. That is gospel truth, right? It's very useful as part of a compendium of things. You've got your books written by modern historians, your primary sources, you've got your Wikipedia. Now, the way that I find it useful is if I look on Wikipedia and I say, there's this bit, for example, okay, with Harald Hardrada, that he was told by the Grand Prince of the Kievan Rus that he had to go out and make a name for himself with wealth and fame and fortune and glory in order to marry his daughter.
Yeah.
Right. Now that sounds like quite a broad statement. Usually there's you've got your reference in the top, and you can go down and see this might have come from such and such a random web page. And okay, well, maybe that's not necessarily reliable. But sometimes it will say things like, comes from this primary source, and you're like, oh, okay, fine. Well, I will go and read that little bit of that primary source and see if I agree with that interpretation of the evidence. That's how I see Wikipedia as being useful.
That's fair. Yeah,
it's like a pointer.
And to even aid to that, I would say, like, because occasionally a random web page can be something like History Hit or History Extra or something, which isn't necessarily an amazing source, but it's still an article that has been researched because it's a professional network, especially History Hit. I know they've made a couple of kerfuffles here and there, but it's impossible to research the amount of stuff that a professional history-based television network is going to have to research and not make one or two mistakes. So I think depends on where the link. So if the link is sites like Britannica, or History Extra, or there's one that's recently, it's World History Encyclopedia, which that actually has their sources listed at the bottom of all of their articles, which is why I recommend Britannica and World History Encyclopedia a lot, because the sources, I may be getting the name slightly wrong, but the sources are all at the bottom, which means you can then do further reading. But if the link is to something like ancientorigins.net, then you could. I remember when Ancient Origins came out, and they posted a couple of really interesting articles, and I was like, the term Ancient Origins makes me think mildly of Ancient Aliens. I'm gonna check some reviews, because there's a lot of
aliens.
Yeah, a lot of history websites have reviews on them. A lot of them will have reviews from historians, and Ancient Origins has like a score of 1.1.
I have been plagued by the Ancient Aliens like you wouldn't believe. The most viewed video on my TikTok channel is about the pyramids, and
I know where this is going already.
So many of the I know so many of the comments are to do with aliens, and it's this is dangerous territory that I don't want to tread my toe in too far. And, weirdly enough, this was probably about maybe the third video I ever made was about this. Now, the video basically says that when one of the pyramids was being built, mammoths were still alive on the planet, right? And
I suppose,
now, right. So that is true, right? On this specific part of,
there would have been,
I think it was Canada. there was a small colony of man, so they were still alive, right. So that was the subject I was trying to draw attention to. Like it was trying to draw attention to the scale of how far back Egyptian history goes, right? But then you start reading the comments, and it's all the ancient aliens. And just I can't get past it. I stopped after a while, just ever going through the comments, and it still happens even to this day.
There's
if you flick through it, it's all like that.
There's no point in arguing. I confess this. Me and Historical Hannah had the big chunk of that podcast is talking about the pseudoscience of it and the morality of Eric von Daniken especially. And I will confess, when I was younger, I did used to believe in it, right? And which is why I know I lose every time I tell us this story that I lose respect, and I'm like the reason I look back on it now is it gives me a new perspective. I can see how easy that is, because what they do is they go, here's the little bit of genuine information, right? And then the regular people then go, oh, okay, cool, this is legitimate information, this makes sense, and then they go, and then by the time you're 4 or 5 episodes deep, and they're going, and this hieroglyph looks mildly like a fighter jet, it's catching people early on, because once they're 4 or 5 seasons deep, you're very unlikely. Like I've spoken to people who are like, oh no, by the end of the first season I pulled myself out. For me it was like season 2, I realised, I was like, okay, they're talking about the Mayans riding dinosaurs now. I know logically this is not possible. There is a possibility that certain species of dinosaurs are still out there. I know there is like cryptozoologists who, and I'm not going to disprove or prove that. But for Mayans riding velociraptors, my jaw dropped, and I was like, okay, this is stupid. And then you sort of unravel it as you go back. But
there's a huge positive to be taken out of that, though. You know, what you've demonstrated there is a very, very skill, which is you've come across evidence and you've decided that, you know, you can change your mind. People are allowed to change their minds about things. You are allowed to say, do you know what? I used to believe it could be. This is a rather extreme example, but like, you can see something like this, and you've gone, yeah, okay. The evidence has now pointed me in a different direction in my mind. What I don't respect is when, you know, people stand by these opinions about like ancient aliens and things with the evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah.
Either you can speak to the quality, the lack of quality of it, or the lack of it in general. And no, I'm not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change my mind. And I think the ability to change your mind is such a mature and valuable skill to have. And you know, if we draw it back to the regular parts of history, and okay, there's an argument, for example, I'll bring Augustus in because it's just the first thing that comes to mind. The second settlement in 23 BC. I used to think, right, that was an incredible step forward in the progress of Augustus' acquisition of power. That's what I thought until I went into my 3rd year of university, this whole year-long class about Augustus. And the professor was of the opinion that actually it was a massive setback in power for him because he lost his ability to stand for consul every year. I sat there and I thought about it for a really long time. And the way he explained it, and you know, we've got the acquisition of the Myas Imperium, etc., etc. And I thought, yeah, do you know what? Actually, I don't think that was necessarily the best thing in the world for him anymore. And I changed my mind, right? So I think that's a really important skill. To be able to see evidence and change your mind about it is a sign of both maturity and your skill as a historian.
I think it's the big fear that everyone has is the fear of being wrong. And it's when you sit there, because like a lot of the people that still genuinely believe in the ancient astronaut stuff, a lot of them are now so deep in that if they admit they're wrong now, they're going to look so stupid. They can't see that it does look bad on them now because they're so scared of them looking bad later. Whereas it's like I say, I think everyone in that belief system has a point. Like for me, it was Mayans riding dinosaurs. There comes a point when they say something like, is there a possibility that in the entirety of human history, extraterrestrials did come down and we made contact? Depends on your view of alien life. did they help us build civilization? Why? Why would they do that? The key question there is, if aliens came down, why would they want these apes that are walking around? Why would they want to teach them how to do civilization and become a potential rival in the future? You just have to look at the game of our own history, because the Romans aren't going to go across. The Romans conquered the Gauls and the Celts. They didn't go, oh, by the way, here's how you build aqueducts. That it's just that basic logic that any extraterrestrial force that wasn't just purely here to science, again, depending on your belief on extraterrestrials, I'm not going to judge people on that, but any force would most likely try and conquer these primitive beings. That's the most likely outcome. Oh, I don't know, what's your, because that's how I disprove it in my head immediately, is that's the basic logical stance.
I have honestly, my honest answer to this is I've never thought about it in that way ever before in my life. Why would they help us? To me, it's always been like in movies. My question is, why do aliens always want to and never anywhere else on the planet? It's just that's what it seems like through that. Oh no, I don't know. Aliens is I don't like to stay too close to the subject.
We'll move on this topic.
Do I think aliens built the pyramids? Yeah. Do I think they built the pyramids? No. And that is for the record. No, I do not think they built the pyramids.
That's it's we're gonna move on from this now. I don't think
movies.
Sorry?
Movies, right? Because this is your wheelhouse, and I think we had a little conversation about this. Historical movies. Let's talk about the merits of that.
Historical,
because we were talking about this earlier on, like the balance between striking an interesting story and delivering detailed history. That's manifested quite significantly in the modern era in historical movies. Things like Waterloo, or recently you've got The Last Duel. Is a modern historical movie.
The Last Duel, I've heard a lot of people complain, especially for that half helmet. That half helmet has really upset.
The half helmet. There are people on YouTube like Shadiversity who have just they are the experts on things like medieval armor. And I saw that film and I thought, oh yeah, there's going to be a 45-minute video on this. I'm going to really enjoy it.
That was the first thing I thought when I saw it. I was like, I cannot wait for the video on this. My place with historical films, I have to tread so carefully here because there is a lot of it's one of those things where it's very hard to walk down the middle. I like to walk down the middle for a lot of things in life. Historical films, you have to take one of two choices. You either have to stay as aggressively close to what the historical message was, what the historical storyline was, as you can, or you have the Waterloo route, right? Waterloo is known, to the best of my knowledge, as the most historically accurate film of all time. I believe History Buffs actually covered this years ago. In fact, the only bit in that film, to my knowledge, that isn't accurate is the ballroom is slightly inaccurate. I could be wrong.
Right.
Then you have the Alexander route, right? The film Alexander the Great.
Which one?
The Colin Farrell one.
Oh right, okay, yeah.
Where Alexander runs around with an Irish accent, which is really. I love that. I haven't. I tell you what, a secret a lot of people realise I haven't actually seen that film in full. I've seen bits. I've never actually.
Really?
I know it's surprising, but I never. Because I was so young when it came out, it just sort of passed me by. And
right, okay.
Yeah, I think by the time I was old enough.
One day.
Yeah. By the time I was old enough, well, now I have no time. Now I have no time. But by the time I was old enough, I was going through my Viking. Every young boy has a Viking phase.
Of course.
So that does add a bit of fantasy, to it. So you've got the middle ground one, right? I know it's a lot of people say it really does glorify Alexander. Yeah. Then you have recent films like The Norseman, which handles mythology and history, right? It's not the most, again, classed as incredibly historically accurate, but it handles mythology well because it's. I don't want to spoil it for too many people. Have you seen it? Are you alright with a quick spoiler if you haven't?
I have seen it. Okay. I have seen it.
All right. So, quick spoiler. Skip like a minute and a half ahead. The way where they handle it is it real or is it just in his head? That's a clever way of handling mythology. I know I've gone on a semi-tangent, but you have to cover mythology when you're talking about history. So I like that. Incredibly historically based. Then you have the controversial films that just go completely off-center. There's an American Civil War film that is so clearly pro-Confederacy. There was another one the history buffs brought out. Yeah, I can't remember, but there's depictions of slaves happily cooking for Confederate soldiers, and it's so off.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So my view is you either have to pick the accurate route or you have to go on to the complete fantasy route, or people are going to rip it apart. Obviously now that it's Metatron covered this very well because it's very hard to talk about because a lot of people go, oh, you can't cast characters as different ethnicities or different races, and it's really hard to talk about now because that conversation is coming up through cinema. My view is you should cast accurately. I have a very controversial opinion. We should be telling more historical stories from India, from China and Africa and South America, rather
you
than.
Think that's a controversial opinion?
Yes, because my view is like the Anne Boleyn casting was very controversial, and obviously the Anne Boleyn casting in the recent BBC show.
Oh right, sorry, I didn't hear who you said. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So that to avoid that controversy, the easy side to me is just make stories about. You've got Mansa Musa, right? Everyone knows one of the most notable people in African history.
Yeah.
You have
literally the richest person ever, and there isn't a proper film about it, to my knowledge.
Right? Why doesn't that exist?
Yeah.
The only, I mean, we've got Apocalypto, for South America, we've got Apocalypto, which is not historically accurate.
I've heard about this film.
When I was younger, it's a Mel Gibson made it, which tells you everything you need to know about it. To my knowledge, Mel Gibson made it. I may be wrong. Again, it's another one history buffs covered years ago. Because when I was younger, I was like, I love this film, but it. It ends with the Spanish coming, but the Aztecs are the villain the whole movie, but they shrink history to like that. So like they shrink like at least 500 years of history into that much. And the Aztecs are the main villain, which makes sense. They weren't exactly, any empire, colonial or not.
I have no idea about
South
American history
my knowledge is
any of these civilizations.
Yeah. I have a rough understanding. It's hard to find sources in English. A lot of them are in Spanish. I mean, to be fair, that makes sense. But so obviously, the Aztec. If you're a tribal group, because a lot the conquest of Central and South America, there was people who sided with the Spanish, for understandable, because you don't like the Inca, or you don't like the Aztecs. But the Spanish at the end are fully displayed as like the heroes coming to take out the Aztecs, and it's just
right.
And you could see where it's like total fantasy. So yeah,
I absolutely agree with you. No, I think there should be more stories like told from these other cultures. Now the thing is, what's interesting though is that outside of Hollywood, that does actually happen.
Yes, I know. Bollywood. Bollywood has a lot of good.
So I mentioned earlier that I'm Indian myself. I'm half English, half Indian. Just to be clear, and I have obviously grown up with Bollywood films, and there are a lot of Bollywood films about things that happen in Indian history. Now, yes, some of them are filled with lots of things like that. That's just the movie industry over there. So part of that, it also introduces a very mythologized sense of the history sometimes, in the sense that you can get a lot of like people flying around through the air, getting catapulted into castles, things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not necessarily going to be the most historically accurate bit. But the point is, these stories in some way are being told. It's just not necessarily in Hollywood.
Yeah.
I know I haven't seen many, but there are a lot of movies made in China about Chinese history.
Yes.
I would like to, I don't know, I would like to know why they don't necessarily migrate over to our television screens as much as our movies go that way.
So there's a movie very recently that was about so this boy gets taken. I believe it was a Tollywood film, where so a boy gets kidnapped, and then there's an Indian guy who's like working for the British, and he gets sent to stop this other guy who's meant to save the boy. I may be completely wrong about the plot, but it's a really good story from what I've heard. About them coming together, and eventually, I believe they fight the British together. Obviously, there's a lot of very overtly evil British, like historic, like the historical villain, like I've got the big. They all have the big curly moustache. I do. That is the only time I regret my moustache. Is every villain has this moustache. Right, but
Here's the thing about moustaches in Indian cinema. I don't know what it is. I don't know why. It's always the policeman as well. It's always the policeman character that's just got this splendid set of whiskers.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen much. I've seen a lot of Scandinavian cinema. I was very much. One of my favorite films of all time is a Swedish film called The Girl King, which I believe is about Queen Catherine of Sweden, and some of the stuff. I think it's harder because a lot of Western cinema is much slower. It's much more like the editing is a lot more. It's still fast paced. I don't know. It's different. It's the editing styles that you can tell. For me, I've seen Chinese cinema move over to Western audiences, but I've never seen any Indian cinema move over to Western audiences. And I think it's because the editing style is so drastically different that it's hard to translate in a way. Whereas stuff like, I mean, I can't really handle French cinema because I find it too slow. When I was in uni, we had a lot of film noir stuff, and I just couldn't get on with it. I enjoy when I have seen bits of Indian cinema. I enjoy it because to me it's always fun and uplifting. Which I've had a lot of people tell me that, oh no, this scene is not that, and I'm like, oh, but so it's how different audiences interpret it as well. Because as I'm watching it through, I'm like, oh wow, this is like, I like this. I wanna, I'm enjoying the vibe. And they're like, and then someone will be watching me going, the character's crying. They're clearly upset, but the editing tells my brain a different story. So migrating, like you say, yeah, those stories are being told, but by a different audience. But again, it feeds into what I was saying. You either have to have the hyper accuracy or complete fantasy. And obviously launching people out of cannonballs comes under the complete fantasy genre. But it works. So when they make historical changes, your brain is already there going, this is fine because 2 minutes ago they was launching a guy out of a cannonball. Whereas like I say, it's a difficult conversation to have because as I said before we started, it inevitably starts getting political, especially with Western cinema. You inevitably find yourself having a political discussion over... And my answer to both sides of that discussion is, in Western cinema, because we are a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, we need to be telling multicultural, multi-ethnic stories. Which is my middle ground of people going, oh, you can't have... Anne Boleyn needs to be gasped by a white woman. I say, okay, fair point. But let's go and let's tell stories about Mansmusa. Let's tell stories about is it Ahsoka? The guy who brought Buddhism to India. I always pronounce his name wrong. It was, I believe it, Ashoka.
I've told to say it is Ashoka, yeah.
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 His life is an amazing movie. Yeah.
I'd love to see those in the cinemas. Okay, I tell you what, because there are also stories where, yes, we've got stories about Mansmusa and we've got stories about Henry VIII that we can tell. But I also like it when we can bring bring them all together into one place.
Yes.
There was a particular scene in the film 1917, or a back of one of the army trucks, and just seeing him on the screen, Sikh heritage, that was such an impactful part of the story, because it just suddenly said to everybody, this was a world war. The Indian Army is the largest volunteer army in history, the British Indian Army. And so seeing that I was like, okay, that is a wonderful way of bringing that all together in one place. Seeing those kinds of characters, because it makes sense. Of course, they were on the Western Front. There were, some of the first shots of the First World War were fired in Africa, in Togo. I think we.
Yes, it was the
colony in Togo, and we had a colony. Oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong now. I believe it was referred to then as the Gold Coast Colony.
Yeah, no, some of the first shots of World War and fighting continued 2 weeks after the armistice. So there are those stories told, and I think that's a great passion to try and really. I've been really trying to read. There's this book that's been written by David Olusoga, and it's called The World's War, and it's precisely this topic of reading about cultures that were actually involved in the Great War, and I found it unbelievably interesting to read about all the like this attack on the radio station or a telecommunication station. That is really interesting to me.
I got some of that they cut out loads there. No, that's fine. I got the radio attack, and obviously the fighting 2 weeks after. It's that again. That's a story we could tell in cinema, and I completely agree with you. The scene in 1917, because the troops from India are hardly spoken about, and that's like when I was researching the Christmas truce for last Christmas, it blew my mind when the Indian troop the encounter the recollections of the Indian troops were I believe it was because obviously the Germans put candles in their Christmas trees. So it reminded them of Diwali. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's one way to say it.
Yeah. So it was like a weird mixing of cultures, and that they understood each other, even though obviously Germans couldn't speak Hindi, and the Indians couldn't speak German. So they understood each other, and they had their own sort of truce throughout the Christmas truce. I never knew that story until I dug deeper into the Christmas truce, because everyone knows the story of the football match, which didn't happen. There were kickabouts, but the football match didn't happen, right? Everyone knows those stories. I had no idea about that story of the Christmas truce. So I think scenes like that, obviously, you will always get people upset about that, but that, in a historical sense, 100% works. So when people criticise that, I say, look, yes, would he have been in that regiment? Maybe not. He could be just transferring from one company. They could be giving him a lift. Obviously, that happened when soldiers got separated. So you can't, if you're going to immediately discount and get upset by that, there's an underlying reason to your criticism there. But if you're going to get upset about the race swapping in Tudor period, okay, cool, but give alternatives. You have to then say, let's put forward these stories in World War One. It's especially in World War Two as well. There's an amazing film about one of the African American fighter squadrons in Italy, and obviously a lot of that. Obviously, they're fighting in fascist Italy, so they encountered some racism.
Yes.
And that's that stories like that, even if you want to take it, even if you're saying, okay, we still need it for a Western audience, there are stories from various cultures. Like Europe isn't just West Europe. You've got you've got Scandinavia, you've got Eastern Europe, North Africa, the Balkans. Which I avoid talking a lot about Balkan history. As I'm sure you've experienced in your comment section.
Oh yeah, no, fair enough.
It's yeah. Anyways, moving off of controversial, we've done ancient aliens and films.
I realised we tried to move out of a controversial section there, and then we just
moved into another one. Yeah.
The reason I love his life so much is because it plays out like and he goes through so much. It really taps into my genuine. If you can see humanity and understand the personal experience, see that, then you're going to connect.
Yeah.
So he goes through losing family at a very early age, losing his and part of his identity. He goes to the Kievan Rus, fights, does the only thing he knows how to, which is fights for as a mercenary, and then goes off to seek fame and make something of himself. And so he serves in the Varangian Guard. Eventually becomes he explores the world. He's in Mesopotamia. He goes maybe to the Holy Land. Goes to the Emirate of Sicily in Italy, and all these crazy little vignette stories. You might have heard that Viking story about getting into a citadel by being locked in a coffin.
I heard the first bit of I've heard the Viking story, and then it cut out the little bit you said of the name of the story.
The story with where the Viking chieftain hides himself and pretends that he's passed away and wants to be buried in a church.
I've heard the rough version of the story. I know of it roughly, yeah.
So this is kind of a theme that seems to repeat itself in Viking literature surrounding the Vikings. But that is also attributed to him in Sicily, how he took over one of So he has this incredible service, gets fame, fortune, experience, gold, and then he comes back and he is arrested, thrown in prison. He gets become part of the coup that overthrows Michael V. He's the one who blinds Michael V, supposedly, or one of his soldiers did, but he was definitely part of that event. And then when he tries to leave, Emperor and he says, "Yes, I'm leaving." Takes all, maybe kidnaps a princess.
I love the maybe kidnaps a princess.
It's probably part of an exaggeration. He legs it on a boat out of the Golden Horn, over the chain, across the Golden Horn, escape, and then leaves with all of his treasure. Comes back to the Kievan Rus, marries the princess. Grand Prince Yaroslav gives him money back to Norway to try and reclaim his throne. And then Victor puts it in a really... he talks about how this is like a northern Game of Thrones and taking place in Scandinavia, where he's making alliances and breaking alliances. Try and keep the story a little bit basic. Ends reclaiming the throne through a combination of betrayal, military strength, sheer luck, and then spends 20 years trying to take Denmark as well. That doesn't really work. And then he thinks, "Oh, I think I might try and do the whole North," and ends up in England. And we get the famous Battle of Stamford Bridge. At which point, I think 50s, maybe even in his... So he's quite old for the time. No disrespect to any older listener.
Yeah. Yeah, he certainly lived... We probably will end it because the mic's going. I think it's the internet. So I heard most of the story. I got the gist of it, but we'll start wrapping it up now because I also realised we've been going an hour and a half.
No worries.
But I will say I think we probably will do this again at some point, and we'll go on purely about Harold Hardrada and some of the people. We got most of the list done. We just went on our tangent of Alexander and obviously yeah. But it's been an interesting talk. Like I say, we'll do more on Harold Hardrada. I do think we did a little. we got a little bit controversial in the middle, but I think conversations, especially regarding to history, are going to get controversial. Okay, like on the odd occasion.
Of course, I don't think you should be afraid to come near them. I think taking a sensible opinion and never necessarily pushing any kind of unbelievably radical idea will allow one to usually pass safely through those topics. But it is important that we get to talk about them. So there you go.
I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier. With don't be afraid to be wrong. So you can especially with the film and the weird the pseudo sciences that I do feel sorry for everyone in your field right now, because there is so much pseudo science hopping around, so to speak. But yes, so before we go, is there anything you would particularly like to plug? You heading over to YouTube? You got a YouTube channel yet?
I haven't got a YouTube channel yet, but an Instagram, Home of History, same username, where I'll hopefully be doing sort of bloggy things as well, try and reach a slightly different audience. But YouTube channel is, I hope.
Well, once it's out, let me know, and I'll put it in the description of this video. So, yeah. So for now, to everyone, just make sure they go and follow Home of History on TikTok and Instagram. Thank you very much for coming on, even though we had the FBI got upset with us talking about controversial. The ancient aliens came down to stop us and got the internet going. But we will do it again sometime. But we'll go more in depth into Harold's life. I feel like Harold Hardrada is an hour and a half conversation in himself.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, again, once again, sorry.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be on here. I've really enjoyed and I think we've had some great fun. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And I think we've had some really interesting conversations. So thank you for coming on, and hope to have you on again in the new year, because by the time this is out, this will be start of December. So yeah, thank you for coming on, and to everyone watching home, see you later. Bye.
See you later.